What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hartness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the quest to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Grace Lau, and we speak about group dynamics in general, the psychological background, in online sessions and in hybrid. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes and find the link to download my free one-page summary. And now, enjoy. Hello, Grace, and welcome to the show.
Hello, Miriam. Thank you for having me here.
I am super excited to explore group dynamics with you today.
Yeah, same here. Let's see where this will take us.
Let's see where this will take us. And on the way to go there, when did you actually start calling yourself a facilitator?
So I've been running leadership programs for a long time. And on the proposals, I always put facilitator there. So you write under the pricing table, how many facilitators will be in this program for how many days. So you have that there. And I do that because your customer would ask you how many facilitators would be in this program. But I noticed that I actually don't call myself a facilitator outside of a specific, like a leadership program context. So as a professional identity, I usually call myself a psychologist or organization development practitioner. It seems to me that people get what that means more than they do it when I say that I'm a facilitator. Yeah. So facilitator becomes a label that it's really context specific for me in usage. Yeah. So yeah, but then again, I think any label can still create some sort of confusion depending on who you are talking to.
Absolutely. And I think the dynamic helped us that a larger part of the world now understands what facilitation is. But it's interesting actually how you phrase it, because I haven't thought about it, that outside of the context of workshops or collaborative work, the label facilitator can be quite confusing.
Yeah, and I recall actually with one of my clients, they actually said a leader needs to be a facilitator because you facilitate the growth of your people. And then in that sense, it becomes so broad. I mean, it's not a profession when put into that context, right? So yeah, I think it's interesting to think about what that means, when you call yourself a facilitator.
Yeah. And maybe it's just the fact of facilitating or the act of facilitating that actually counts independent of the roles and the labels.
Yeah.
So how do you apply your background in organizational psychology then to your facilitation practice?
Well, organizational psychology has a lot to do with understanding human dynamics. So, the assumptions that people have, how interpersonal relationships are built, how trust is built. A lot of it is very much the same as what facilitators know. So how do you build trust? How do you build a safe space for people to speak up? How do you manage the dynamic between people? Everyone needs to have the space to voice their view. You need to facilitate a structure so that people have enough clarity, but not to the extent that it's sort of bounce too much about the content of what they share. So all these things I think really overlaps with psychology, or maybe the other way around. Yeah, psychology overlaps with the facilitation profession. So yeah, I think the application in a way is quite straightforward. But of course, I mean, in my training as a psychologist, there's a lot of conceptual models that you use, which I sometimes articulate when I'm in a facilitated session, but sometimes I don't, because you just apply it. Yeah. So it really kind of depends on the objective of that session as well.
Yeah. And I can imagine that in some circumstances, it's an overkill to share all the theory behind the things you're doing, while it has more power if you guide the group through the experience so that they understand it without knowing the theory.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes I think once you put the theory out there, I mean, some people love it. I mean, there are groups that I work with that actually ask for theories behind what I'm doing, and also even citation of the research that is behind this method. But at the same time, I would say at least 80% of the people I work with don't find that necessary. In fact, I think throwing out theories can turn some people off. You need to flex a bit there.
Absolutely. And since you mentioned psychological safety as one of the aspects and group dynamics, of course, where you have the direct application of psychology to facilitation. So how do you approach then the big topic of psychological safety from your background as a psychologist?
So I think there really are multiple aspects in here. When I started out early in my career, I focused more on the individuals. So there's actually a stream of psychology that's more about the individuals. So you look at, for example, personality or mindset of the individuals. And then there are things like growth mindset, which basically is a concept about how you emphasize more on the growth and not on sort of success versus failure, more on learning and experimenting. And those sort of mindsets help people to feel more safe, because then they know that, even if something was not going as expected, it's not necessarily a failure in a sense. It can be a learning opportunity. It may actually means that you have taken a risk. So no matter what the outcome was, that in itself, taking risk was already something to encourage. So in the beginning, it was more about cultivating that mindset among individuals. And I think, in the beginning, just setting the stage, doing a bit of framing helps. But then later on, I actually move more into a focus on group dynamics and also social psychology, which is actually more about the group and interpersonal dynamics that shapes the atmosphere. Then it goes beyond the individual, right? It's not just about if an individual is feeling safe or having this, openness, but also how the group can encourage more vulnerability and risk-taking versus closing everyone up. And then with that, it's really more linking to facilitation and the sensing of the dynamic in that moment. I think that really is a skill of many facilitators to be able to stand on that spot and know that if people are feeling that they can share, or that maybe some are feeling judged, whether some people are more outspoken than the others, and what's the impact of that. It can encourage others to share more, but it can also have the opposite effect of shutting others down. So I think it's that dynamic that now it's becoming more of my focus. I still think the individual piece is important, setting the stage so everyone sort of have this basis that, okay, we carry certain mindset into a session and we leave out certain mindset when we enter this session. But then with that already done, that dynamic that emerges in the moment, it's also really critical.
Which makes total sense, because you have all these individuals, and as you described, everyone ticks differently and has a different mindset and a different personality. So you cannot actually handle each individual, and it might not matter, because also depending on the group dynamics and these maybe more dominant personalities, the individual also changes.
Yeah.
Right? Because in some environments, and I know it for myself, in some environments, in some groups, I become very outspoken and very extroverted. And in others, I totally shut down and want to hide myself in a corner, and I'm very introverted.
Yeah, exactly. And thank you so much for that great example, Miriam, because that really is the essence of group dynamics, or sometimes, if I want to bring out theory, then it's group relations terms. Because there's first the idea of, yes, individuals have their valences. So the idea is that you can be more prone to, for example, becoming more of an extrovert or a quiet one. That's individual, as almost like a personality background, you have that. But it doesn't mean that an extrovert is an extrovert all the time, or that an introvert is an introvert all the time, because the group shapes you. Actually, it may sound a little weird, but when I'm in something called Group Relations Conference, so this sort of experiential session where you really just explore group dynamics, there's even this idea that no matter what each individual group member does, this person is doing it on behalf of the whole group. I mean, it can be a little extreme, almost like you don't have free will as an individual. Like, okay, if someone speaks, it's because the group wants this person to speak. But in a way, if you reflect on your experience, I'm sure there's times where maybe you wanted to say something, but then you were sort of maybe processing inside, and then you were a little hesitant to say that. But someone else said it. Basically, the person was saying something that you were thinking, and then you just then have to agree. And then you kind of have to wonder, if you think from a group perspective, maybe in a way, somehow unconsciously, you are nudging the other person to say it on behalf of you. And maybe it's actually something that's controversial or a little different from the mainstream idea. So it's actually more risky for anyone to raise it. And you're just glad that someone else took the risk. And then you can then decide if you want to then jump in and support, or still just let's see if that person, gets cut off immediately, then I'll shut my mouth. Yeah. So I just find it's really fascinating how the context, the situation can really shape the sides of you that you show. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's still what I find tricky or fascinating is, so the group is an entity by itself, and still it's shaped by these individuals. So what kind of impact do you have on this group of very diverse personalities, where some might impact the entire group more than others?
So this is interesting, because when you think about some may impact more to the group than others, you need to ask, okay, is it really because that person is just a really special individual, very different from the others and becoming extremely outspoken? Or is it because others kind of want this person to be their advocate without themselves needing to speak to put themselves out there? So I actually recall this one experience where I did a session related to unconscious biases, and then it was funny because everyone did this, what they call like an implicit association test. Basically, they did a mini assessment that tells them if they have unconscious biases. And obviously, most people have. I mean, it's just
that's how we function.
And then, so the whole atmosphere was a little uncomfortable at that point, because now you're sort of faced with this truth that
the conscious bias.
Yeah. And that was a group with both men and women leaders. And then somehow it was all the men who were just sharing and talking and voicing their opinion for half an hour. No women spoke. And then it was about unconscious biases, and specifically relating to gender roles. And then you got to ask, okay, so on the surface, it almost seems like, okay, there's something going on. Some people are having more voices. They are affecting where the group is going, because just a certain demographic of people are just taking more space. Yeah. And then sometimes just articulating that observation helps. So I was like, okay, let me just pause here for a while before we go on with the discussion. I've noticed that in the past half an hour, only men spoke. I wonder what that says. And then, of course, the room was like, like suddenly the energy level was like, why you've just opened this box of worms. And I was like, oh, you know what, let's call a break. And then, interestingly, after the break, actually during the break, a lot of the women spoke. And then there was a very different energy that happens during break time. And the women were sort of grouping together. And then they just talked a lot. And there were men joining the women group. But then it just seems like a different dynamic during break time. And afterwards, the dynamic changed as well. So we restarted. So it's shift. So sometimes just articulating that pattern helps. Does that make any sense? Yeah.
Totally. And I think, the power of voicing something that is unsaid or gets lost between the words is very powerful, which also shows, as you described, that suddenly then the energy drops. I think this is one of those moments for a facilitator that is very scary, because you actively interfered into the group dynamics and what's happening. and impacting, the energy, as you said.
Yeah, and it's a risk. I debated inside myself, okay, should I say something? But I think ultimately I go back to the objective that I'm hired for. And so, of course, no one says that I'm hired you to make them uncomfortable, okay? But, I'm hired to help people raise their consciousness in this aspect. And at that point, I was thinking, okay, if I don't say it, then I'm not doing what I said I would do when I actually do this. So, yeah, that helps.
What do you think is the general impact of the facilitator on group dynamics? Where does it start and where does it stop? Also in terms of responsibility.
Yeah, great question there, because I don't know. I think it first is largely depending on the context, but I also feel that in general, a facilitator seems to be seen more as the authority figure when you are in the room. Then you get projected into as almost a mother or father figure. So you're either someone that would take care of me and then I'll be nice to play nice, yeah, or someone to rebel against. And that happens too when you make them uncomfortable, for example. So you have that. And then sometimes I've also experienced people see you almost as a sibling. So if I have created enough safety that they feel that, okay, I'm really sharing so much with you, then you must be on my side. You feel this pull to become part of them and to almost advocate for them, because sometimes I'm hired to understand how people are thinking, how the employees are, for example, responding to certain changes in the organizations. And then you almost feel this pull to be on their side, and then you have to then advocate for them. After you do this session. So, okay, after the session, maybe I'll meet someone senior in the organization. Then these people may expect you to then do something to advocate for them. I'm not saying that I will or will not. I really, depends, because I think part of it, my job is to synthesize and summarize my observations and do share. So maybe that alone can be seen as a form of advocating for them and taking their side. Yeah, but at the same time, I think it's also something to be cautious about, because that means then I'm no longer neutral. So then can I still be this sort of really neutral facilitator if I'm completely taking one side and not the other? So that's another, another aspect that I do think it's quite important to look into.
I would like to dive deeper into the concept of neutrality, whether it's actually possible, and also linking it back to what you previously said about the unconscious biases. Because just because we are hired as a facilitator does not mean we are free from unconscious bias.
Yeah.
Right? So I think being pulled into these different roles as a sibling, an enemy, or partner in crime, or even a parent.
Yeah.
How do you maintain neutrality, and actually, do you have to? And how do you deal with your own unconscious biases?
Actually, good point there. I don't think I really can be. I don't think anyone is 100% neutral. I mean, because neutral is a relative concept, right? So if I'm neutral in this group, then but maybe the whole group is relatively more extroverted than the other group. So from the other group standpoint, this group overall is not neutral. So it's maybe it's not a helpful label to use. For me, the key is to be conscious, at least more conscious, or strive to be more conscious about my own stance and my biases, and to be clear about that. So I think it's important. It's more important to acknowledge my bias than to try and suppress it, I think, because I don't think that suppression works very well. Yeah. I recall, in a lot of the sessions I run, I would throw some exercise where people need to figure things out by themselves. Yeah. So it's not like I can give them a completely 100% clear instruction and then they just do step by step. That there are things that they need to figure out, and they're learning from that exploration. Yeah. And often people will ask me if I can just give them more examples, or give them like more detailed instructions about exactly what they will do. And then I would say, on one hand, as your facilitator, I want to be helpful. I want to make sure that you also think that I am helpful and I'm not deliberately making you uncomfortable. But at the same time, my role is to ensure that you get this opportunity to explore and learn in that way. So I am now deliberately choosing not to share more so that you get this opportunity. I would rather articulate my stance and also even my inner struggle a little bit than to just give them what they want or shut off and say, just go ahead and do this. I think that articulation of the tension that I experience within myself is often very helpful, but I think it also takes a lot of courage, especially if you're with a group that's you're not familiar with.
Yeah. And I think it's a very thin line to walk, because to phrase something that you observe that can be maybe totally off, because sometimes we have a feeling that, or we misinterpret silence, for instance.
Yeah.
And then voicing it, depending on how you do that, can either signal to the group authority. So that you have this observer role and you sense something and you're courageous enough to voice it. But it could also come across as insecurity, which then also impacts the group dynamic, right?
Yeah, because then you are no longer the safe container that allows them to move. So if our facilitator doesn't know what she's doing, then of course there's no way that we can move forward, right?
Yeah.
It's an interesting point. I found myself changing my approach a bit. I think when I first started out, I was a little more cautious and I would probably not be sharing so much. Maybe it's actually my insecurity, so that I don't want to be seen as insecure. And of course that in itself is insecurity. And then I just hide that. But now I actually find myself articulating my own struggle more, just because I think people sense it anyway. Yeah, that's so it's interesting. It's not that I don't want to hide; it's that I think hiding no longer works. That's even if they don't call you out, they sense whether or not you have hesitation, and that's why I'd rather put my hesitation out there. And I don't know. It seems that people actually see that as role modeling, and they almost open up more. They share their struggle more if I do that. I don't know. Do you experience something like that as well? I mean,
totally. And I think what you said, that if you struggle or if you doubt and the group senses it, you endanger the safe space, because if they cannot trust the process, or if they sense that something is wrong, then they won't feel the permission either. And I think by showing by example that it's okay to voice that, it also signals a security or confidence.
Yeah. And that's, it goes back to how, a lot of the group dynamics happens at the unconscious level because we don't want to voice it out. And I think in a way that makes it harder to address if we just keep everything under the table. Maybe there are more people who are feeling insecure, but if no one starts showing vulnerability, then no one will show. But then again, I feel that it's also can be a risk. I still think, it is. I have to say, it is a risk. So I wouldn't say, everyone just go ahead and share all your insecurity in front of, of your participants.
Interesting group dynamic.
Yeah.
And I wonder to what extent we can actually catch ourselves, because I think it's very difficult for a human being to be aware that we impact the group. So if something is off, if we have, for instance, awkward silence, or suddenly the dynamic changes, how do I know that it's because of me, or it's because of someone in the group, or a totally external factor?
Yeah, actually, this is, again, great point, because I wouldn't say I know the answer. I don't think there's anyone who can, judge in that moment and say, oh, okay, so this is because of my own projection or because of these two people having a certain dynamic. Yeah. But I do think even just being able to pause in that moment and ask what you've just asked, that already helps. because that means you are basically, at least you're stopping this thing that you keep blowing up in your head. Yeah, so you're pausing and taking a step back and saying, okay, so everyone in the room is co-shaping that dynamic. In fact, I would even say there are people who are not in the room. The whole context of how this session actually came about, that whole bigger context, bigger system affects also the dynamic that happens in the room. Being able to pause and ask yourself, okay, what might be the key factors influencing current patterns? And even, okay, what really is the current pattern? Yeah, sometimes it can seem so chaotic, as if you want to find out, okay, who really are the key opinion leaders? Like, why are we suddenly going from here to there? Like, why did the whole subject suddenly got shifted to somewhere else? So sometimes even finding that the train of thoughts of how things evolve, it's not easy, especially if you have a bigger group. Being able to pause and ask, okay, so what just happened and where we are now? Okay, what really is our objective at this moment? I think that's really helpful. For me, I actually recall, a few years back when I have a break, I would actually hide in a bathroom and just think about that because I needed that space by myself, right? Otherwise, you have all these people talking to you during break and then you just have no time to think. So I just sort of, okay, let me just lock myself in the bathroom for 3 minutes and think about this. If I have a co-facilitator, that helps a lot because then you can at least talk about someone. And when you talk with a co-facilitator, others sometimes do that. They will not intrude your conversation. So you have that space. But now, actually, I noticed that I would even, with groups more used to this sort of facilitated approach, I would even just put it out there and say, okay, so where are we heading now? Even just say, I'm a little confused about our objective now, because sometimes just things just, change. So asking the group, empowering the group to be more conscious of where they are heading, to be conscious of their group dynamics, I think that's extremely helpful. I would even sometimes pause and ask, okay, so whose voice do you want to hear more?
I like that question.
And just sort of pause and bring the whole group to look at themselves at a different level before they go back into the content of the discussion. I find that very helpful. Of course, some people may find that disruptive. But then again, in a way, I think we are hired to be disruptive.
I was about to say exactly that, to disrupt the dynamics that are the usual flow that's going on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And if things seems to be going on so well and so smoothly, I would even sometimes doubt and ask myself, okay, is there something else? Like if it seems to be going so well and everything, and because then I ask, okay, why didn't they already have this smooth and effective dynamic before I'm here? There must be a reason why an external facilitator is hired in to do something, and they're expecting you to do something that's changed the pattern that existed in outside of the session. And actually, there was one experience where it was more training and less of a, but then anyway, so it was still a session, a workshop, and everything went very smoothly. And the ratings were good, but then somehow I felt that people were not really there. I don't know, like they play along, you know what I mean? Like, but then I don't think their hearts were there. And then I asked the organizer later on, I said, you know what, this doesn't feel right. I mean, it seems to be right on the surface, but doesn't feel right. And then she said, you know what, this workshop is something corporate tells us to do. So all the different countries, they need to organize this. So essentially it's a checkbox. Everyone knows that. So we're just going to, play along.
Interesting. And it's actually sad because it's a missed opportunity.
Of course. And then, of course, that conversation became very helpful data to then fit into go back to the big system and say, okay, you know what? We need to explore what really is going on when you roll out all these workshops in all parts of the world. And there are different parts of the world, and people just think, okay, I'm just doing it because corporate asked me to do it. And so that was it. It ended up to becoming a helpful thing. But then that session itself, I wouldn't say it was. I wouldn't say it was a workshop. I mean, it was a show, right? It was just like a show, yeah.
Hi, this is Andrew. I'm a facilitator and head of customer success at Session Lab, the dynamic workshop planner tool. More than 30,000 facilitators, trainers, and coaches use our workshop planner tool and save time and effort in the design process. So, how do they do it? Our drag-and-drop agenda builder makes it easy to transform your ideas into high-quality workshops, and the timing of your agenda automatically updates when you make changes. You can collaborate in real time with your colleagues and easily share professional-looking printouts with your clients. And if you need inspiration, you can check out our library of more than 500 activities and exercises and simply drag the ones you need right into your workshop agenda. So check out Session Lab to save time and effort in your workshop design process. And now get your first 2 months of Session Lab Pro absolutely free at sessionlab.com/workshopswork.
And knowing what you learned after, what would you have done differently to maybe just add a little grain of sand?
Well, I think asking more about the why people are doing certain things, that would be helpful. That said, I also think that some patterns are so stuck and it's so so common. It's almost become a habit in that system, because it's not just about that one workshop, right? If that one workshop got rolled out because that it was just following instruction from corporate, I'm sure this is a pattern that applies elsewhere as well. Be it workshop or something else, yeah? So I think knowing it's helpful, voicing it is helpful, finding relevant stakeholder to explore this is helpful. But I also think it's important to not expect things to be changed immediately. And also not to judge and say, this local person is bad because this person does not explore the why, does not communicate their real thoughts to corporate and just roll it out like a show. I think it's important to not judge people that way, because I believe no matter what pattern there is, be it you think effective or not effective, healthy or not healthy, there's a reason why this pattern exists. And usually it exists because it also serves some function. Maybe because it reduces conflict. If you just do what it's told, then of course you reduce conflict, right? And then maybe people are so busy already, they have no time for extra conflict. They would rather just check the box. And maybe even checking the box in itself can have some benefits. So some people can still get good takeaway from a session, even though it's not something that they demanded. Yeah. So I think it's not judging and just sort of articulate what's the current pattern. Ask what this pattern is serving. That's a helpful start. It's done before you it's in the background, right? They are the context of your sessions and not within the session.
As you said, that there are dynamics outside the group that impact. And I think you're making an important point that maybe it's not necessary to disrupt, because also you don't know the impact. If this is something that works for this organization, there are good reasons, and who are we to believe that this needs to be disrupted? And what would be the consequences, actually?
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want to open the Pandora box.
Yeah, or to throw anyone under the bus, because you and again, it's so easy to put judgment onto an observation that sometimes even articulating the observation becomes risky, or that it can trigger unintended consequences. So yeah, but I would still go for articulating it, but definitely in a way that makes it positive, because I think no one has usually, people don't hold bad intention in a context where they want to run a workshop. Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. And I mean, talking with you about this just makes me realize so much of the work of a facilitator is done outside of that session.
Absolutely. I think that for me, the most effort is actually all the preparation before and the documentation after. The workshop is just a flow. I mean, in the best of all cases, it's just flowing, because you're prepared, you can adjust, you can be nimble to whatever happens, but the work beforehand cannot be, there's no shortcut to that.
Yeah, before and after, because that's, in a way, you play a role to the whole bigger system that shapes this system. I mean, you can still you control more in a way within a session. There's still more that you can control, within that session. But there's such a web of interference or influences that's outside of that session that I think, it's interesting. I mean, I know maybe it's a little off topic, but I recall you're doing some sessions on related to money topic about being a facilitator. And that makes me wonder, because a lot of facilitators still charge by the day that they deliver for that program. But really, there's just so much consulting work before and after in order for that session to be successful. Just interesting pattern again.
Yeah.
Explore why, yeah.
Especially because you cannot design a session in a vacuum. So you need information about the group, the context, the purpose, in order to make sure that you can deliver something to the group that is actually valuable and more than a show.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you describe it as the process of designing for the session, right? But I would say those conversations does more than designing for the session. Those conversations themselves are a sort of coaching for the system, or I don't know, coaching, consulting. Like, you are playing an active role in shaping the system in the process of designing. So I would even say that just calling it the design phase doesn't even do it justice, because you're not just designing for that one day. I would even say all those conversations that happens in the design phase change so much the bigger group, the system dynamics, that even if you don't decide that, maybe a one day session isn't the solution, that you actually don't deliver that facilitator session, there's still a lot of value add already. Yeah, sorry, just went completely off tangent there.
Not at all. And maybe one observation can bring it back, because I think through all these conversations beforehand, you also impact the group dynamic.
Yeah.
Because you're setting expectations, you're setting roles of why someone is in the room and what is expected from them. And I think depending on how each individual sees their role and how they function as a group is shaped by this pre-workshop phase.
Yeah, absolutely. Even basic things like who will be in the room. Sometimes some clients have a very specific name list and then they start there, but sometimes it's not. And then that obviously will change the dynamic, because being to be in or out, that makes a big difference. Right?
Yeah. According to you, what makes a workshop fail?
You sent me that question before, so I had time to think about this, but I think that's really not an easy question to answer, even with that time for preparation, because I think it depends on how you define failure. So I gave you the example of, this really smooth workshop, everyone gives high rating, but it was a show. So, with objective measure, it was successful, but in a way, it wasn't really a success. Yeah. And because for me, having some outcome from a session, like let's say some action items, it's quite different to people actually committing to taking those actions. Because you can also have a session where people, everyone has action items, but do they do it? Or it can be like, okay, maybe there's only something that seems really lame as an outcome. Okay, we have decided that from now on we'll do this, but they actually do that. Even though it's a small shift, but they actually do it, and then it creates a different pattern. It has a ripple effect. Well, then it's a big success. But you wouldn't know that it was a big success until at least a month after the session, when you actually know that they've done it. And then they tell you how that little steps change everything. So I actually had one example with a client where it was a long workshop, but then ultimately the only outcome was, so they've decided that anyone can decline joining a meeting. It's just because everyone's so busy. Now, on the surface, that's just like a minor thing. But when they actually do it as a team, it just frees up capacity and people can focus on what's strategic and important. So that was, a small thing that ends up to have a big effect. And there's also another piece about addressing elephants in the room, because sometimes you may set out with one objective doing a workshop, but then in the middle of the workshop, you sense that there's elephant in the room. So if the group decided that, okay, you know what, we'll just forget the initial objective and go towards that elephant in the room, then actually I would see that as quite successful, because I think it moves the group to where they needs to be. But then if you measure their outcome with the objective that was set in the beginning, then it's definitely a failure, because it was completely a different direction. So yeah, a long answer to that question. I think it depends. I know it's an annoying answer. Depends.
But from what I hear is actually then failure would mean a lack of impact. That if the session does not cause any transformation, even if it's just a slight one for the participant.
Good point. I think it's, in a way, for me that is true, because most of the time I'm hired to facilitate some sort of transformation. Yeah. But at the same time, I think there are also sessions where the whole point is to have a space where people can bond and have fun, and then they can be human, and
that's a huge impact, right?
Yeah, that's of course still a huge impact, but then it's not the kind of impact that is like, that you
measurable.
Yeah, maybe even measurable. I would still say it's just, those are not like strictly business actions. Yeah, it's just bonding. Yeah, but it's fundamental for any teams, I think. So yeah, it's hard to measure, but there can be some soft objectives that are sometimes not articulated as well, I think. Yeah.
To come back to group dynamics, and you mentioned the elephant in the room and also how the individuals impact each other. Do you have the impression that it's easier or more difficult to handle or even to sense group dynamics online than it is in the physical space?
I actually think it is more challenging to do it online for subtle dynamics, yeah. But you can still sense it through people's voices, but then that's given that if they do voice, yeah. So it's not so much the content, but the way that things are articulated. I think you can still sense group dynamics there. But if people are being quiet, then it leads to what you mentioned earlier about the interpretation of what it means to have silence in that session. With online sessions, I usually would identify a couple of participants who I already maybe had some conversations with during the design phase, in the preparation phase. And I might actually sometimes have to private message them and ask, okay, what are you sensing right now? Just to have something that's on the side. I mean, I do that in a face-to-face session too, to have side conversations, pulse check more on a one-on-one basis. But I think in online session, that tends to be quite helpful. And then I also notice it depends on the platform, which is very interesting, because now I sometimes run sessions where some things will happen on Zoom or whatever, like video conference platform. But at the same time, people may have a chat group on their phone. So it could be a Signal group or WhatsApp group, that sort of thing. And then sometimes you will have them do big group sessions with the laptop. So they do the video conference thing there, but they may share things like a photo or, some thoughts on their mobile phone in that group. And then you actually sense a lot more of the dynamic when you look at the messages on the chat group and not from the Zoom space.
Interesting.
And I find it really interesting that it almost seems like people have different preferences for different channels, and in some channels they feel that they can share more freely, and other channel they can't, even though it was the same session and with the same group of people. So for me, I think there's still a lot to explore about how can we better sense group dynamics in online setting. But I'm sure there are ways.
And I wonder whether it has to do with priming. That if you're in a video call, especially on Zoom, where everyone has the same size, or maybe just a speaker is large, and maybe you don't see the entire group. You have this more official or formal setting, and then WhatsApp might be more associated with informal conversations, also because you can quickly share your pictures.
Yeah, so that's my guess. My hypothesis actually would be a really good research for some psychologists to do this, to just explore, because I really can sense that difference, but the why, I don't know. Yeah.
And I've even realized the impact of having other video conferencing tools, like for instance, InSpace or Wonder, where you have the bubbles where participants can freely move around, which is more difficult, I think, to facilitate because there is so much freedom, but it brings a new energy level to the group.
Yeah, absolutely. So and I find it interesting to see how people experience the shift to a new platform. So when it seems to me that, thanks to the Never Done Before community, I've tried so many new tools now, and I've introduced that to my colleagues. And just, in our weekly meeting, we try different tools. And I find, the energy level definitely boosts every time we try a new tool. It's almost like, it doesn't matter what that tool is, but if it's new, then there's this novelty, then people become more active. And of course, there are also certain tools that seems to stimulate even more certain kind of energy, like with Butter, for example.
Oh, yes.
They have this option to do sound responses. And so that, you have this really interesting dynamic, and suddenly everyone is responding with sound. So yeah, I think platform definitely shapes the pattern, and it shapes your ability as a facilitator to detect the dynamic.
Yeah. And since you mentioned Butter, we had a demo session this week with Never Done Before. And it was interesting because with Butter, you can basically raise your hand and say, do you have a question, a comment, or an idea? And on Zoom, usually what the dynamic is, if you want to say something, you unmute yourself and you say something, or you wait until someone gives you the voice. So suddenly, with not everyone knew about this new way, it changes almost the implicit rules of the interaction, that suddenly you have to stand in line with your comment. And it's interesting to see how quickly the group adjusts to that and just accept this new rule. And when someone comes in not doing that, it's suddenly a disruption if someone who does not stand in line unmutes him or herself to just speak.
Yeah. Oh, how rude. Right? And I think this is a challenge, but also an opportunity for us facilitators doing online work, right? To explore, okay, if people can adapt to new rules so quickly, then what does it mean when we talk about, okay, what is civilized behavior? What is polite? What is impolite? And there are all these stories people create in their heads when they see others doing certain things on an online space, which it's new to everyone. And all these stories also change the dynamic because it could just be someone who didn't know how to unmute him or herself, and then it creates this little bit of annoyance among others, and then you have this story about the person, and then you change the whole dynamic because of all these stories you tell about each other. And I think it's interesting times.
Which makes me think of how important it actually is at the beginning of a session to just remind everyone of the rules of the game. This is how we listen. This is how we speak. This is how we stand in line or we don't.
A great point there. And then all this ground rule setting, and assume positive intent. If someone didn't follow the rules, it's not like they intentionally wanted to disrupt the whole thing. Giving space for people to actually disrupt. So, just pause and say, okay, what are the rules you want to change? Maybe even ask people, what are the rules that's happening? Actually, that's something I tried when we did, because I'm really into group dynamics. So I did this session where it's almost an experiment to us, where it was an online exploration of group dynamics. And it's so funny because basically what we did was we have this people calling into this Zoom, and then we ask people, what's going on here? So what's the group behavior in the here and now? And then lost, because it's almost like fish can't describe water, because it's so like your way of working, it's so a default. You can't even articulate it. And that was how it was like in that setting. So it was like, okay. And then people started to say, maybe we were all waiting for someone to speak first because we wanted to be polite. So now there's this assumption about what means by polite. And then someone say, okay, it seems that when someone is silent, everyone else feels the urge to pull that person in, as if like you must. So now there's this implicit rule that everyone must say something. Otherwise, the assumption is that you're disengaged. It's interesting, right? That we don't often actually explore what are the unarticulated rules, but there are on all these online platforms.
I'm curious actually to reflect on how different settings change the dynamics, change the implicit rules, and maybe sometimes it's even an individual or two who might change the rules for the entire group, most probably even without noticing it.
So yeah, actually, I recall one example. I remember in the early days of the pandemic, how we all shift to Zoom and and then at that point, I always thought in the beginning, I was always thinking, okay, so we talk in a group, so that's the space where conversation will happen, or in the breakout rooms, but it's always through the video call, yeah. But then I was then in this session where someone said, feel free to use the chat room to just share our thoughts and have a dialogue. And then what happened in that session was you basically have two conversations happening in parallel that sometimes intersect, but there are two conversations. And what amazes me were how the chat room was more active than the video call room. So there was even some points where there was almost just one person keeps talking in the video call and the others were just really sharing a lot of their thoughts and new resources in the chat room. And then all these sort of emergence of new rules. And it was all because the facilitator said, feel free to use the chat room as another dialogue space. Quite interesting.
Yeah, be careful what you wish for. Because if you're then facilitating mostly the video space, and I think that's our assumption when we're there as a facilitator, our main focus is on the video and on the verbal voice conversation. But then if we open the opportunity for a parallel conversation in the chat, we really either need an MC or a co-facilitator
to look at that space.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because my default is also more the video conference space. But then at the same time, sometimes you have screen sharing that blocks you from actually seeing people. I notice myself actually now sometimes shifting more to looking at the chat more than even the screen. I recall there was one session where I asked the co-facilitator to look at the faces of people while I look more at the chat room. Yeah. It also depends on the participant group. So I have some sessions where the participant groups are all pretty nerdy folks, and then I just knew even before the session started that they would prefer writing than talking. They would not want the spotlight to be on them. So I should design the whole thing to be more writing heavy rather than speaking heavy, and it works really well. So I might think it's interesting to see how we also can pivot different forms of facilitating, and that shifts the whole dynamics.
Totally. And I think also that coming back to your example with having two parallel then conversations basically going on, to what extent it means that the group is deciding that, or maybe dismissing the person who's taking too much space on the screen. Because what I realize is sometimes you have these individuals, they would share a lot and take a lot of space and time speaking. And then suddenly someone opens the conversation on the chat and everyone's attention is there. And I think then the high art of facilitation, maybe the scary job, is how to voice that and bring the group back. Because what it shows is that the group decided that there's a different space which is more relevant to talk about.
Yeah, and I think that's you've just described how a facilitator can sense the group dynamics in a virtual setting and then respond, in an adaptive way. And I think it's exactly what you described. You can actually start articulating and say, I saw that there are a lot of input, and start integrating the two, and that tends to be quite helpful because then you can start asking people who shared in the chat group to just articulate and elaborate on what they've shared. And that usually helps to bring the whole group back to a focus. At the same time, I also have experience where sometimes in the video call session, you have 2-3 people discussing about something that's interesting, but then you have the chat box where people they actually are responding to that conversation. But it's just that they don't feel that they want to respond in a verbal way. Yeah. So that they're writing it down, and then I'll just allow that to happen because maybe someone maybe they have background noise. There are many possible reasons, but then you can, for me, if I can still see the connection between the two conversations, then at least then I know that, okay, everyone still kind of is aware and it's not completely split into two things.
Yeah, it's a question of alignment. And then the chat can actually enhance the conversation without disrupting it because everyone wants to speak. Some might just want to add a comment.
Yeah.
And since we talked about group dynamics in general, and then in the online space as a post, what do you think that facilitators need to pay attention to, thinking about how dynamics change in the hybrid space? And with hybrid, I mean that there might be smaller groups of people being in the same physical space, but meeting together in a virtual space.
Yeah, I think that this is really not an easy question to answer because there are so many different types of hybrid, and also because by default, those who are physically closer will be closer. Yeah, you just have more sensory information than the others. So it goes back to the purpose of doing the whole thing, the whole objective. The idea is, if it's okay to have the people who are physically together to be closer, maybe they actually work closer in the same location, then it's fine. Then I think it's easier, to manage that. But if the goal is actually to break this pattern and to ensure that everyone can connect with everyone else, especially people you don't see often, then I think that more attention needs to go into the design and the technical bits of the session. I find it usually quite helpful to have one electronic device representing one person who is, remotely present, because then that allows this device becoming the physical representation of that individual. So you can still sort of move this person around. And usually if that device is someone's cell phone, so one of the physically present participant's cell phone, that's even better. So it's almost like a buddy. So this person can just carry the other person around. So sometimes we'll have physical objects, like we put a post-it on it with the person's name to represent the person. Ideally, it's a physical object where it also allows you to put a phone on it. So it's really like the person is there. And I do that quite often now, just because of circumstances. It seems to work okay. But then I still think to sense group dynamics, it is a challenge, especially if you want to sense the dynamics between the remote people and the physical people. I think you can sense the dynamic within the online space or in the face space, but that line in between seems to, for me, it's still quite an unexplored space.
Yeah, and I wonder whether it's actually possible, because by human nature, we prefer the people who are physically close to us and will interact more with them just because we have more information. We see the body language and the facial expression, we smell them. And all of that. Yeah.
It's very different. I have some clients who has team members located some in one space and like some scattered, and many of them have decided to run sessions 100% online, just because they don't want to create that difference. In fact, they wanted to encourage that difference.
Yeah, and it democratizes the entire session. Everyone has the same opportunity to interact with everyone else. Yeah,
I think personally, as a facilitator, I do prefer it that way as well. It's just, I don't know, the dynamic seems to be healthier. That's what I sense. Yeah.
Because you don't have the side glance. So sometimes it's just this one look. If two people share a glance, and then it changes everything because suddenly they're aligned, but the rest is not. Yeah. And on a video conferencing, if everyone is behind the screen and looking into the same screen, everyone has the same chance of doing that.
Yeah, exactly. And there, again, I think it's the whole thing about the stories people create. So I think, actually, that might be for me. It's the biggest issue I have is when some people are physically together and some are not. And if the ratio is, so again, the ratio of people is important. So if it's just really 90% of the people are face-to-face and it's just two people calling in, I can still understand that. But if it's like 5 people doing face-to-face and the other 5 are calling in, then it's a little trickier. And the 5 who are calling in will probably have stories in their head about what the other 5 are doing. Because they are physically together, then there's all this assumption that emerges.
FOMO.
Yeah, exactly. I must be missing something. And they must have all these side conversations, and I'm disadvantaged because I don't know about these. So all these, you want to minimize that. Or you can address this, but then that takes time.
Yeah.
That just takes time from the session. Yeah.
True. And just it's a different level of psychological safety that you need to create, because of course we all have our insecurities, and then not knowing what's going on aside and not having the opportunity to actually interact at the same levels, of course you will feel disadvantaged.
Yeah.
I haven't asked you about your favorite exercise.
Oh yeah, and there's so many of them. Again, you asked, you gave me that question to prepare, and I was like, I actually made a type out my thoughts, and I have this list of things I like to do. I guess one I like to, I guess I can share this one. I call it radical inquiry, but I'm sure it has other names. It's something I learned from the Human System Dynamics Institute. And essentially the exercise is about, so imagine 3 or 4 people in a group, and then the first person will be sharing an issue that he or she faces, he or they faces, and the others, after hearing that issue or challenge, they will just be asking questions, and then the person who gave the issue will not respond at all. Mm-hmm. So it's just the others keep asking, and I'll actually encourage people asking crazy questions, like, so what kind of song would you choose to represent your issue? Or how would you describe your challenge to a 6-year-old? And then another one I like is, what question do you not want me to ask you? So it also stimulates the person's thinking from so many different angles, and it changes the usual pattern of question and answer. Because the usual pattern of question and answer, actually, it doesn't expand your thinking a lot. I mean, it does a little bit with the questioning, but the question can usually just go to one direction because the answer sort of bounces your next question, right? But with this approach, your question go to 10 different directions. And then there's also no pressure of needing to ask smart question. And that's a challenge that a lot of the coaches I know face, like, I need to ask that $1 billion question. And then there's also no pressure to give brilliant answer. Yeah. Because you actually can't answer. And so in the end, whatever questions that's helpful, then it will be helpful for the person, and the person will know it. And if it's not helpful, it's also fine. I mean, then it's also a practice of asking questions. And then the people rotate. Yeah, it's really an exercise that's so simple, but I get very good feedback and responses from people saying that this really helps to change the dialogue. So sometimes if the whole session has a main objective shared by everyone, then after we do this exercise, we have everyone come back and share, okay, so what did you get from this? And then it actually changes the energy and also the focus, and helps everyone moves to usually a more creative and innovative angle. So love it. Yeah.
Love that. Question brainstorm. Absolutely. And you can see you perceive the perspective someone has through the questions they're asking.
Yeah, you get that too. And for me, that's actually is the part where I sometimes need to intervene. So I'm trying to shift the group dynamics to make it less. There's no hierarchy in this process, right? But then sometimes when you have someone who keep asking questions like, okay, have you thought about this?
That's not a question.
Yeah. How are you going to make this come true? All these like very specific how question that almost sounds like an instruction to the other person. Yeah. Then there's this dynamic of pressure that goes from one direction to others. Then sometimes you need to remind people to just go crazy and go creative. Yeah.
Yes.
By the way, I just want to share another reason why I like this is because I think asking creative questions, helping others think from different angle is a facilitation skill. And for me, this exercise helps my participants to eventually become better facilitators themselves. And for me, that's important because I think facilitation skills is something that non-facilitator needs to develop as well. Yeah.
Love that. Thank you for emphasizing. If someone fell asleep after minute 2, just woke up and doesn't have time to listen to the entire episode again, what would you like them to take away?
Oh God, I have to ask Gordon because he will revisit the whole episode and he will then find out the the nuggets of useful advice or input. Let me think. I guess be conscious about how you as a facilitator is shaped by the group dynamics and how you shape the dynamic in return. It's both ways. I think sometimes facilitator may think it's more sort of you changing the group, but actually the group shapes you as well. There's this energy that push and pull you to different directions as well. And if there's one takeaway from this, is maybe try and be a little more courageous to show vulnerability and articulate the tension that you are experiencing inside, because that would encourage others to also be more conscious and clear about their intention and to show vulnerability.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Absolutely. Thank you so much for this thought-provoking conversation.
Thank you, Miriam.
Took a lot away from
what I was looking for. Yeah. Thought-provoking.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention, as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.